Okay, guys, I wanted to put together a video to kind of take you through the writing process for a narrative so you can make sure that you are on the right track based on what we've been working on in class. Okay, so, and I always have ideas for stories in my head, and I shared a video. What day was that? Tuesday, maybe, about an idea stemming from one of my kind of ancestors or relatives from my family tree, something that I found interesting. I shared in class yesterday another idea I had that I'd come across when I was researching things, um, events, any really kind of related history to the setting of my young adult novel that I'm working on. And in that, I explained where I was setting my novel in Gary, Indiana. So I had an idea about Lyman Bostic, who was a professional baseball player, and he was senselessly shot and killed in Gary. And this was at the time that Gary was, well, one of the many times Gary was considered to be the murder capital of the world, meaning like people per capita kind of thing. So, based on its size and whatnot. Another thing that I came across in my research was what I'm going to share with you here. This was the sinking of a ship, a big vessel that happened in 1958. And it's known as one of the deadliest, largest sinkings in the Great Lakes, like ever. So I'd already had some notes that I had jotted down at home. I had some screenshots of information that I had found while researching, and I just like to take screenshots with my phone to kind of capture it to go back to it later. And what I had initially at the end of the day yesterday was this document where I was kind of thinking through the plot. Okay, so we have this ship called the SS Carl D. Bradley. It wasn't bad enough that it sank and most lives were lost. There was actually some drama afterward when the company that owned it, U.S. Steel, which is the company who basically built the city of Gary, um, because of the steel operation they had going there, they did not want to take responsibility for the sinking of the ship because the vessel, they were trying to prove the vessel was sound. There was nothing wrong with it. It was simply the storm or the waves, some act of God that had caused it. That was actually not the case. So I was thinking through some different aspects about that, whether I wanted that to be the more pivotal point in the story or whether the climax would be how the two, well, there were only two survivors. So, kind of looking at how they survived. Four of them were able to make it onto a raft. And I thought through, well, maybe that would be an interesting aspect to narrow in on and try to think through what it would have been like on that raft. So I worked to kind of establish a general setting, the time, the place. Then, obviously, not all 35 who were aboard the ship would be characters in the story. That would be way too many. But I just kind of started narrowing down, okay, there were 35 aboard, 33 of them died. Out of the 35, 4 were able to make it to a raft. Out of the 4 on the raft, 2 were able to survive. There were many, the majority of the crew members who lived in Rogers City, Michigan. It was a very small town of only like 4,000 people, and 24 of the men of its, working population were aboard the ship and died. So that was a huge, devastating loss to that community. I could, look at that as a story angle as well. So there are a lot of different possibilities. Last night I did more research and wrote down more notes. I like to write things by hand first. Just helps it stick in my brain a little more. I can use different colors and arrange things the way it makes sense in my mind. So I can show you that in class, but I didn't scan my notes in or anything. So this is what I have right now to start with. I am going to use my notes and start to attempt a rough draft based on story elements, based on the information that I have, and I'm going to show you how my rough draft is going to be very rough. So I'll be back in a moment with more. I'm not going to make you watch me type this. Okay, so if I am thinking about my exposition, I've got to start my story in an interesting way, and I also need to work in characters and setting to set the stage for the reader for what is to come. So here's what I have so far. One good thing to do when you're revising is to read the story out loud to yourself, or you can have a friend, a trusted peer editor, read it out loud to you, which can help you catch any little mistakes or things that maybe you didn't quite mean to sound the way that they do. Walls of icy water barreled into the side of the ship. This wasn't the first time that the Bradley had encountered a storm of this magnitude, nor was the ship a stranger to cold temperatures. Navigating the elements as best he could, Captain Roland Bryan was concerned but not frightened. He was aware of the difficulties the old girl had begun having in her advanced years, especially after some of the situations that had gone unreported. She had been traversing these waters for more than 30 years, and she was due for a checkup after this last haul. Her rusting cargo hold had needed to be replaced for more than a year, but the bosses at Bradley Transportation and the Michigan Limestone Division of U.S. Steel weren't too thrilled about the prospect of shelling out $800 big ones. "It's only $800? Watchman Mays had scoffed one day when he had overheard Roland and First Mate Fleming discussing the Queen's troubles after she had run aground earlier in the week. Oh wait, I just noticed something. So when it said discussing the Queen's troubles, I actually just added this part in here to get more character development, and I just realized down here is when I introduced the ship's nickname of the Queen of the Lakes. So calling it the Queen's Troubles up here wouldn't make much sense to the reader. I'm gonna leave it there for now. It might just be because it's not too far away from when I do describe it. It might be okay, but I'll just give myself a little note here, and I'm just going to say, haven't told Nick yet. I'm just going to put that there as a reminder because he is, the way that this is written, the captain is kind of flashing back a little, thinking on something. So it might end up working. We'll see. It's only $800? Watchman Mays had scoffed one day when he had heard Roland and First Mate Fleming discussing the Queen's troubles after she had run aground earlier in the week. Fleming had tried to reprimand Mays for eavesdropping, but the captain had intervened. $800,000, son, Roland corrected. May's face had colored at the realization of his mistake, and this had made Fleming laugh out loud. Roland maintained his kind smile as Mays had scurried away. The memory brought the smile back to his face. Roland also chuckled a bit to himself, now thinking about how the delay in the shipping season had given the Queen of the Lakes some extra rest. With the steel industry suffering, and the SS Carl D. Bradley's sole purpose of hauling limestone, she had been decommissioned in July. It wasn't until October that she was put back into service. U.S. Steel was squeezing as much life out of the Queen as they could, and the raging storm outside was beginning to test her limits. So I put this in right here, the raging storm, to kind of remind the reader that that's where the setting is currently, entering this storm. Okay, so I'm leading up to this November 18th, 1958. Actually, it sunk at 5:30 p.m. Well, that's really, it only took about 10 minutes to sink. So this was between like 5:30 and 40 p.m. So I'm trying to remind the reader that that's what we're getting back to. I'm trying to work in a little of the backstory while then using some sentences or some, words or parts to bring it back to the setting. Now, on this cold November evening, Roland had steered his 639-foot Queen along Lake Michigan's western shore to take the building southwest seas on her stern. This right here is a little bit tricky for me. This one here, to take the building southwest seas. It's maybe the verb I need to work on, to take the building. To steer. No, I've kind of already said steer. I don't know. I'll mark it here. Fix. Take. A powerful low-pressure system had formed over the Pacific yesterday as they had departed Gary, making its way to the region this morning. I added in this as they had departed Gary to show the connection to Gary, Indiana. I might need to clarify. I'll just make a little note here. Clarify it? Okay. Temperatures in Chicago had dropped by 20 degrees today, and the captain had been looking forward to getting his men back to shore. Thanksgiving was just over a week away, and he knew the families were anxious to have their men back on dry land. He had been making good time when a radio call from headquarters derailed their journey home. U.S. Steel needed another delivery, and Roland was ordered to steer the vessel back over to Rogers City to load more limestone. He could no longer use the shore as a shield. And that right there is my setup of where we're at, what's going on, and who is involved. And where I'm thinking I'm going with my rising action is talking about the different things that happened. They talk about aloud. So let's go here. I'll just make myself a little note here. Action. And these were in the notes when I did some research last night. So there was like a loud bang that was heard. Let me go back to the notes. Loud bang was heard, and then a big vibration was felt. That is actually when the ship basically just snapped in two. So I'm gonna try to build that up using the characters that I introduced, because they are two of the men who were floated. They actually, Mays and Fleming were the only two survivors, and they were the ones that were on the raft. So then we have Mayday was called. They tried to abandon ship. And they tried to release the lifeboats, but because of the speed that they were traveling and the, elements of the weather, one couldn't, they couldn't even get it out, and the other one, when it did come out, it was all tangled in the cables. So that didn't work out very well. One of the only raft, I think it was, the only raft basically was washed over the side of the ship with many people included. And okay, so I'll put this raft and people washed overboard. And then I feel like that's when I'll get more specific about who made it to the raft and how. And they were not found, I believe, for like 15 hours they were on the raft. So kind of break down the main parts of what happened while on the raft. And that will lead me up to the climax of, I guess the climax then would be more so like getting discovered. I don't know, I'll have to play with that. And then our falling action will address, there was some controversy, remember, about the ship and whose fault it was. So that can kind of, take care, because it was addressed afterward pretty quickly in terms of, within the next year. But then it literally wasn't until, I think, 1997. Yeah, that, so Frank Mays thought, he saw the ship basically snap in two. And U.S. Steel did not want to honor that, because that would have meant it was their fault and they would have to pay out a lot of money, which is another reason why I wanted to put in the part here about them not wanting to pay out a bunch of money. So that's kind of foreshadowing to where I'll be going, kind of to the falling action and resolution